This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Stephanie Sparling Williams, the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum. Her curatorial practice is predicated on interdisciplinary research, writing, and teaching on American art, and foregrounds Black feminist space-making. She is the author of Speaking Out of Turn, Lorraine O'Grady and the Art of Language from 2021, and Toward Joy, New Frameworks for American Art, forthcoming in 2025. Her scholarly work is invested in the space of the museum, with a focus on African-American art and culture and the work of U.S.-based artists of color, as well as material histories, cross-cultural exchange, strategies of address, and contemporary art that engages with the history of the United States. In this conversation, we discuss the transformative work of Black study and Black studies, the museum as community and political space, and the place of beauty and joy in thinking about Black life. Hello, Stephanie. How are you today?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited to start my week. It's Monday. Start my week with this conversation. You know, we go back a ways, and I've always really loved your work. I love your work as intellectual work, but also really interested in hearing how your intellectual work is translated into your curatorial practice and your thinking about art. You're thinking about Black culture, history, and the future. So this is really exciting. I'm really happy you made the time. Thank you.
Of course. It's an honor to be in conversation. I'm really excited.
So let me start not really with the question of Black studies. We'll get to that and sort of where Black study and Black studies figure into your thinking and practice. But I want to really start with the broader question or more personal question and ask you to narrate a little bit of your intellectual journey. You know, what drew you to the study of Black life that has played out really in this intense engagement with Black art? What drew you to Black studies, and really what sustains your relationship to these?
Yeah. So without exaggeration and hopefully without cliche, Black studies really changed the trajectory of my entire life, which is actually one of the reasons I'm a huge proponent, little side note, of kind of so-called or then called diversity requirements, because my intellectual journey, you know, an awakening, you might call it, really started in one such class taught by Dr. Raylan Rabaka at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I had gotten into the journalism school. This is an undergrad with plans to pursue a career in marketing when I needed to add a course that would satisfy, you know, I think it was like a race and culture requirement. And I remember quite distinctly that Intro to Black Studies was the only one that would fit within my other courses. You know, I had dozens of possibilities that I could have selected from. But Intro to Black Studies fit perfectly within the classes that I needed to take. And it was taught by Dr. Rabaka, and it shook me. It changed my major. It changed my life. And of course, because of my experience in that program over the next 3 years, I'm sitting here on this podcast with you today. At the time, I was also an artist, and my practice expanded in order to really process, you know, what I was learning in Black studies, and part of my practice became, you know, kind of this trying to think through the intellectual traditions, the histories that I was encountering for the very first time. And so it was in my second year of undergrad that I decided to get a double degree in fine art, where I studied painting and photography alongside Black studies, which really culminated into kind of my first major intellectual project, which was an honors project that brought the two together. So ultimately catalyzing graduate work. So I brought, you know, photography, I brought Black studies together and did an honors thesis. From there, I completed my PhD at the University of Southern California in American Studies, where I studied the art and culture of Black Americans through a set of interdisciplinary lenses of cultural theory, Black feminist thought, and art history. And, I went on to pursue postdoctoral work, a fellowship at the Yale University Art Gallery, where that was really the first time I came into contact with the work of collection stewardship. And I was deeply fascinated. Part of my role at the time was to serve as a bridge between academic departments that were underserved by the collection and the art museum. So departments like African American Studies, Gender Studies. And I was feeling, admittedly pretty burnt out at that point, burned and burnt out by the academy. And I was curious what might be possible to do with this interdisciplinary American Studies, by way of Black Studies degree. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, and just to kind of get where I am now in that story, really before I had a chance to dig into that work at Yale, a position became available at the Addison Gallery for American Art, and I left the fellowship to become a curator, and I haven't looked back. So thinking, picking up on that fascination with collection work, it really became a context for thinking about the methodologies within Black studies, and more specifically, Black feminist studies and Black feminist thought, which has really guided and shaped my curatorial practice, where I am and what I do today.
So I'm curious, I want to ask a little bit about that moment you're saying, that you told about an intro to Black studies. I mean, of course, that's every teacher's dream, is that they're, of all classes, their introductory class, right? The one that often people feel like they have to take or sort of randomly ends up being life-changing. And by the way, I've been emailed, and we'll hopefully sooner than later have Rebecca on. So this will be a nice continuity across the podcast.
Yes, incredible.
But I'm curious to hear hear you talk a little bit about what that was like for your art practice. How did your art practice end up being informed by the study of Black texts and Black history, or was your art really already sort of Black studies informed, Black studies themed, that then that sort of Black studies or study of Black life ended up just clarifying or giving a vocabulary for what you were already doing, right? So how did those end up being in a relationship?
Yeah, in short, it was just transformational, to be honest. I did not grow up. I grew up, coming into that context. The University of Colorado at Boulder is one of the whitest public universities in the country, or it was at the time. And so I was coming into a very white space from a very white space, a very, segregated place of privilege. Even though I'm raised by a Black woman, race was not something that I had fully thought of in relationship to my own experience and existence until that Intro to Black Studies course. And so for me, it was really, it was revelatory. It was transformational. And so the art that I was making was really out of a place of needing an outlet to process, like the shock, right? The shock to the system. Imagine learning about the transatlantic slave trade for the very first time your freshman year in college. And the sad thing is that's really the experience for most people, because we know that the experience, like Black histories, Black intellectual traditions, they're not being taught as regular curriculum. That's why the field exists, right? That's why the discipline exists. So for me, my art practice really just exploded just as a response, just to this kind of racial awakening or awareness, really. As cliche as it might sound, that's really what my experience was.
Yeah, it's funny you say cliche, because it really is also the dream of teachers, to have that cliche. But also, asking this question across these podcasts, Ashley and I are going to sit down and talk a little bit about our impressions or thoughts on how people narrate their way into the study of Black life, because it's so interesting the way classes and books are actually so deeply central. While also for other people, sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it's family legacies, conversations. But the way it's a reminder in so many of these conversations in the podcast already, the intense impact of just simply putting a book in front of somebody reading that book, and everything looks different after.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I have to say too, when you say, the learning about the transatlantic slave trade for the first time as a college student, to the extent to which, Black history is taught in any school at this moment, I just think so much about the future of teaching about Black life in an age, and we're talking on Monday before Election Day. This won't be live for a while, but
Yeah.
but we may be entering an era where that's completely erased from high school curricula, and the burden then of people teaching about Black life, whether it's in hanging art on walls that children walk through or assigning books in a required introductory class, our burdens just become so intense. But those burdens are also the capacity to change a life with one thing on a wall, with one page in front of a student. They read on iPads or computers now, but some kind of page in front of them.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you how you imagine the field of Black studies. And I think this is an especially interesting question to ask for you, given the curatorial work that you do, because the field of Black studies is, of course, an academic field, but it's always been an academic field that's moved from campus to community and back. And so it has at its origins this tension, how people think about it as a tension, a contradiction, a struggle, but some sort of tension between the desire and the need and the demand to study Black life, that this hadn't been a part of college curricula at the time, and the disciplines as they exist weren't doing this kind of work. And so Black studies emerged as a demand to, put Black art, Black literature, Black history, and so forth into the idea of what education is, what study is. But it also came at a moment where Black liberation struggle had tried to break down the political boundaries between campuses and communities. And so out of that, I think, comes this really interesting political imperative in Black studies, which is to be prescriptive. But there's also this intellectual imperative of Black studies, which is to develop the Black intellectual tradition. So I'm curious both in your own imagination of the field of Black studies, but I think about it really in terms of how it impacts the kind of work you do. How does Black studies function in your imagination as an artist, as an art curator, but also as an intellectual?
Yeah, I really do like this question a lot, because Black studies for me has always been beyond a set of, so all the things you just said, of set of intellectual inquiries, traditions, political imperatives. It's also been very practically a interdisciplinary context, or home, if you will, for the work that I wanted to imagine doing in the world. So, recognizing perhaps a lack of maybe methodological or theoretical focus, or maybe less of a focus on art, its history, and the visual in Black studies, I would say at the time. I do think that that's changing now, especially, with the work of scholars like Christina Sharp, Lee Rayford, Tina Camp, Sadia Hartman, and many, many others. The work that I was most interested in pursuing early on was really more legible within a discipline that had emerged, just as you said, from the exact limitations that I was actually experiencing in the field of art history, for example, which I believe, of course, were similar, to these limitations that were experienced by scholars, activists, cultural critics, who were historically building the disciplinary bounds of Black studies. That is from this position of being strategically marginalized in the academy. So I guess, put another way, at the time when I was, coming into an understanding of Black studies, my desire to study the art historical contributions of Black Americans and Black women in particular was actually not legible within traditional art history departments. I do believe, of course, that's changing now, but at the time, we're thinking, 2008, 2010, 11-ish, when I was really coming into my own intellectually. But a project like that was not seen as adhering to the field's carefully guarded parameters of legitimacy. So American studies, by way of Black studies, became the place where I could pursue a kind of both-and thinking, really both Black and visual, both historical and even phenomenological, thinking both intellectual and cultural, aesthetic and political. I could go on all day, spatial and embodied. It's wild, but here we are. That Black studies really felt like home, and a space where I could do all of those things, even if Black studies wasn't doing all of those things itself all of the time. It really gave me a sense of possibility, and I think that possibility was emerging from that space of the parameters, right? The limitations that we had previously set on any number of disciplines.
I love that idea of Black studies, not so much in terms of content or sort of political intellectual aims, but just as possibility itself.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I haven't heard that in response to this question, and it's really interesting the way it gathers so many of the things about the origins of the field and the current practices and expansion of the field without creating it as a set of tensions, right? Because possibility is a way of actually affirming tensions as just two contrary possibilities.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, after all, English departments do have fiction and nonfiction.
They do
as well as poetry.
Absolutely.
No, I think it's, for me, it's always interesting to think about the kind of demands we put on Black studies that we don't put on disciplines. I think sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's not fair. But I love this idea of, what is it opening up in terms of possibility as its own kind of reward and its own kind of lure. And that really comes out. It's interesting, Christina Knight, whose podcast came out back in October, talked very similarly about the field of art history, what Black studies being a sort of way of having all those things you wanted in art history, right? And I think of a number of historians, in particular, too, who have said the same thing about historical practices. So yeah. All that's to say, I really love this idea of opening up possibility. So related to that, actually, I wanted to ask you, your work is a really interesting mix of study and thinking, right? To doctorate in American Studies with all of the Black Studies content in that. That's also artistic practice. So it's infused with imagination and study. And I'm wondering how you see your work that you're doing now in relation to the field of Black Studies. Like, how do you think about it fitting with the tradition of Black Studies? And how do you also think of it as expanding elements of the field?
Yeah, another great question. Where to start? So I'll just start with my greatest source of inspiration, really, like intellectual and creative, is Black women studying Black art and Black life. That's kind of really the foundation for me. And the text I actually have been having students read since I began teaching a decade or so ago is actually Bell Hooks's essay, An Aesthetic of Blackness, Strange and Oppositional. And she published this essay in 1995, I believe. And she opens this essay with this really beautiful vignette where she talks about her grandmother's house and how that through her grandmother, she learns that the ways that we live shape, or the ways that we understand ourselves in the world and live are shaped by objects and how we look at them, and how these objects are actually placed around us. So she's talking about Black aesthetics, she's talking about the Black home, but she's also talking about like kind of Black radical space making, which is such an important concept to my work. She sees her grandmother as someone who is building a kind of Black aesthetics because she's learning, about beauty in her home. She's learning about color. Her grandmother, she talks of her as a quilt maker. She's talking about her home as a place where she learned how to look and learning how to see, right, herself in the world and thinking about the beauty of every day, the quotidian kind of beauty that what she was surrounded by, not only the natural environment, but the built environment. So I think it's really interesting for me. That's where I really start, is like Black women describing Black life and in visual terms. And I think she uses, Bell Hooks continues in her own work to think about Black aesthetics, Black looking. But I do think it's interesting how it all started with her grandmother's home as a space where we learn to see as a community, perhaps, but as certainly as she as an individual. And so this Black radical space making, or this idea, this aesthetics of Blackness and this politics of aesthetics, if you will, this for me is Black studies too. And these are the horizons that I'm often looking and building toward, which really comes down to, in my own work, exploring what it means to kind of proliferate an abundance of Black feminist ideas and aesthetics into the institutional fabric of art history and museums. The curators, Janet Dees of the Block Museum at Northwestern and Alyssa Swindell at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth, they are both individually, they've worked on a few projects together, and collaboratively, I've been really inspired by the ways that they're exploring how institutions actually might feel obsolete or less obsolete if we accept the work of Black feminisms and Black studies as an urgent task. Beyond the increase of representation of Black bodies in museums, but a fundamental shift in like the material circumstances. So, doing this work, thinking alongside other curators and scholars who are interested in the ways that Black feminist theory, Black studies might help us change the material conditions of institutions where we learn to look and see art and culture, I think is really compelling. And for, so again, this too for me is what Black studies opens up. These are where I see the possibilities of the field.
I love that. And it's interesting to think about, you started your response with bell hooks. And it is interesting to me to ask this question about sort of how your own work relates to the past and future of the field of Black studies. And that bell hooks is kind of, she's part of the history of Black studies, but in some ways her name and her thinking is a new horizon. And so, I love that as you were saying, this open up, how a text who should be a canonical figure perhaps is, I think sort of rhetorically is, but I don't know that in curricula and book writing is. A canonical figure in Black studies is someone who opens up possibilities rather than constrains them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And thinking about art space as where that's actually practiced, I think is just so completely important. Yeah. And related to that, so thinking about making these kinds of ideas in art space, I'm interested in, you narrated a bit your intellectual background in Black studies as an undergraduate, American studies, Black studies and art history informed, PhD. You've worked in Africana studies, you've worked in art history as a teacher, but also doing curatorial practice, and now you're a curator. And so I'm interested in how you see the relationship. In some ways, you've said a lot about this, but maybe say more. How you understand the relationship of those years of study to the way you do your practice now. Like, how does it inform your aesthetic, your imagination, your thinking, all those things that go into arranging a space in which this art that you care about can make the statement that you want it to make?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I think one that I've had the opportunity to think about a lot lately, because I just recently reopened the Brooklyn Museum's American Art Wing galleries, where over the last 3 years I've been working on just a massive transformation of those historic spaces. And, to think about what Black or African diaspora it's really for me about epistemologies. I've always been interested in the ways of seeing and being in the world that Black studies really illuminated for me really early on, and how those relate to the production of art and what I often describe as, again, this kind of radical Black space making. So on the occasion of the reinstallation, I've been thinking about the application, right, of these epistemologies as lenses. And, as a Black feminist curator, one of my core concerns is how the collection, so in this case, the Brooklyn Museum's American Art Collection and these galleries that we just reopened, might be a place of enjoyment, actually, and belonging for Black people. Recognizing that museums are vehicles for social belonging. Everything from how we or how the work is presented, how spaces are staged, how artworks are installed within specific parameters of taste and, style. These are all acts of power, right, that set the terms for social belonging. And these are the lessons that the field of Black studies has taught us. And it is from this understanding that I think about spaces and I think about collections and how we might chart new paths forward in research and interpretation, how we might think, creatively and uniquely about alternatives to traditional displays of American art. And when I say American art, what I'm really working with is a collection of art that was made pre-1960s. So we're thinking about this as historic art and, art that I think really in today's contemporary moment requires a sort of curatorial bridge between our audiences and what they're most excited about, invested in, and also these histories, right, that these artworks come out of, which have been almost nearly exclusionary when it comes to non-white people, non-white makers, non-white artists, non-white traditions. So I'm really interested in, what we did with this transformation is think about how those who have been strategically marginalized, particularly Black people, see and experience the world, and using those kind of knowledges, those sets of standpoints, or, in thinking about Black feminist thought, the positionality, right, from which Black women see and experience the world as like rich and rigorous lens for how we might be able to see American art or experience the space of the museum. And so that's where my work has taken me and where Black studies has kind of inflected my own approach and my own understanding of the field in which I work.
So listening to you talk, that was super interesting and really thoughtful. Thank you. I'm really struck by how what you were describing as the moral and political function of a museum space is in some ways the way I think many of us think of a Black studies classroom. Right? A lot of that vocabulary that you had was similar. I mean, they're of course different for a ton of reasons. But maybe as a follow-up, I'll ask what I ask myself a lot about. When I think about how I imagine a Black studies classroom, then I actually ask, well, what if I start from that Black studies classroom? How does that speak back to my own work in Black studies? So I'm curious, maybe in that way, how has that work in museum space and that kind of thoughtful, ethical and political questions of belonging and epistemologies and so forth, does that make you see Black studies differently rather than Black studies sort of informing your creation of these spaces?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And admittedly, not one that I've thought about a lot recently, because I have since at least the last 3 years, I haven't been teaching. I used to teach quite a bit at the intersections of kind of Africana studies or, Black history and art history. And, I would think about histories of art and African Americans in kind of, I think what you're asking me to think about is this dialogical kind of move between the ways the field itself is understanding itself and articulating itself, and then the ways we as scholars and as cultural, theorists working within the field understand and articulate our work in the world. At least that's kind of how I'm interpreting your question. And so,
and thinking about how the museum space speaks back to that imagination of the field, right?
yeah, absolutely. I will say, and so, admittedly, I've not thought about this question specifically on those terms, but I will say what I think the museum as a space has to offer Black studies is a new archive. And I started to feel this way when I was working with collections for the first time. What does it mean? I've yet to read, at least, and please, if you know of such a text or if you know of such a study, but a work in Black studies, or that kind of is at the interdisciplinary crossroads between Black studies and collections, like museum collections, art collections. What does it mean to build a collection? What does it mean to create a history of American art that is inclusive? I think we use that word, and over the last few years, certainly institutions have been called to task for their lack of diversity within their collections. But we don't talk a lot about literally how collections are built and what does it mean to build a collection when we're talking about the means of cultural production, there being such an uneven access, art historically and, historically. And when we think about the Black experience, when we think about the history of art and African Americans in this country, specifically looking at what kinds of creative production did we have, were we making and creating out of historically? And what were the stakes of representation? I think these are the questions that the museum, that the idea of collections and art history can offer to Black studies for scrutiny and how it can imagine itself within an archive that's not purely textual, but actually visual.
I really love this. I think you should put together, whether it's an essay or a collection of essays. I think this is such an important question because we, meaning me on the side of university professors, we do our own collecting all the time. I collect books, I'm pointing, but, I have this shelf here. I'm working on a project. I've collected the books that I think are important for it. I collect books and materials, films, music for my syllabi. Right, but sitting back and thinking about what's going on in that moment of collection, I actually, when you started talking about that, I was like, I have no idea, right? But I think in the same way that archivists are often frustrated by the way scholars talk about archives, right, without actually having ever done the work or thought about the work that goes into making the archive, and that's not it may or may not be a labor question, but mostly an epistemological question, and an aesthetic question. This is knowledge and feeling production.
Absolutely. Well, and when I was in academia, I did a lot of institutional critique. Like my dissertation is like 99% institutional critique, critiquing the American Art Museum without having ever understood how collections are built, without having ever understood the actual institution. And so I think that that's one thing that we often think about. We talk about the archive, we talk about, we maybe even gloss or mention the space of the museum or the site of, this institution as one that is dealing in cultural belonging. Whose cultural belonging is obviously something that we can unpack, but I think we're often critiquing from a place of not really understanding. And I think part of that work, and like I said, what the museum perhaps as a site, the art collection as a text, or even if you're reading the art collection as an archive, can offer the field, I think is actually something that's I would be quite excited to dig into and to think about.
I love that. This has been a great conversation, but if just for that question, this is so worth it. I had just never put it in those terms. So thank you for that. And that the fact that you'd been framing everything that you've been talking about for the last, handful of minutes in terms of epistemology, it's all of a sudden like, yes, this collecting is an epistemological event. We all know that, but I don't actually know anybody talking about it. Because again, I'm looking at these books. Yeah. It's absolutely an epistemological and aesthetic event that I collected these books for my own work. But there are these other collections that then we have, as you say, we may have a sustained critique of without understanding or thinking about the antechamber act that actually makes the entire thing possible, the collection and the collecting. Okay,
Absolutely.
great.
And what might be necessary to intervene, right? Because it's one thing to critique, but one thing I've really appreciated, at least about Black studies, and, kind of, I've heard, I think it was on your podcast with Christina Knight, where you're, kind of the double bind of, rendering oneself obsolete, and which I think is, as a field, is one's work complete? And if it is, what is kind of that completion? I think part of it's what is the solution, right? We can critique the collection. Mm-hmm. We can use the collection as a site to point to the ways that Blackness has been written out of the history of art. But what does it look like to actually deploy a set of tools to reorient, right, the collection away from white supremacy? Because that's really the project that I'm interested in. That's what I do within my position at the Brooklyn Museum. Is I'm really invested in this idea of reorientation. How do we reorient these massive collections away from white supremacy when I won't be able to live 200 years to build, a collection exclusively of art by Black makers? What are there ways that I could still do that work of reorientation? Are there ways that we could still breathe Black air, to use Saidiya Hartman's, thinking of radical acts, and, how do we create a different terms, even within, thinking about a canon that's largely white and male, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of my questions, as about, how do we imagine the success of Black studies as a field, but Black study more broadly, in this case, in connection with collecting, with museum spaces. Is it to build this sense of undigestible meaning, right, in Black studies, whether it's methods or content, that just becomes its own thing, or is the index of its success actually to have so diversified the fields, in the case of the university, disciplines, in the case you're talking about, collections, so that we really don't need this thing called Black studies anymore? Again, as you said, 200 years, that's an ambitious number, right? So let's say 200 years. How do you imagine the success of Black studies, especially in relationship, I mean, maybe you just answered it, but in relationship to this question of collection and curation? Is it to really just cultivate this robust sense of Black studies, of Black art, that has its own ground and doesn't, and that's our accomplishment? Or to have absolutely diversified all of those things that touches to the point where we really don't need this category Black studies, this category maybe Black art?
Yeah. I think it's interesting to your question, this idea of success, or I'd like to think that I am one of Black study, the field. I think there's so many of us that consider ourselves success stories of Black studies in the field's work. I hope that's not kind of, I don't know, too big-headed of me, but I do feel that the work, I do get the sense that this work will never be finished. In essence, that I think our aims and maybe our strategies and our goals shift over time. But I do think that as long as we live within systems of white supremacy and defined by power, one's relationship to power, the methods, the thinking, the intellectual traditions, and the politics that have informed and brought the discipline about will always be useful and for thinking about, how we exist outside of or against the grain, or in, different orientation to these white supremacist systems. Even if it emerged as a particular kind of intellectual project within the academy, the fact that we have seen the field expand, in these capacious ways that allow for work like mine to take root and to to move through and beyond, what we may have imagined the field as being possible or even containing. Maybe folks don't believe that I'm truly, a Black Studies scholar or curator. I don't know. I don't actually know what fits or defines. It's been a minute since I've thought about the bounds of the field, but I'd like to think that the more blurry and slippery and capacious that we imagine Black Studies to be, I think the more we'll see its success, like its impacts. Maybe that's the word I'm actually maybe looking for. Its impacts in the world, and for sure, the future that I'm imagining within the art museum is one where we're breathing Black air. And I have to imagine it's possible, but I keep pinching myself like, wow, I can't believe I got away with that, to be honest. Like pulling out of the toolkit, the Black feminist toolkit, I'm like, wow, can't believe I got away with that one. That's great. And I do think that yes. I do think that it allows us to think differently, about our tools and what's possible.
And absolutely, I think that the expansiveness of Black Studies is something that both gets underplayed and often overplayed in conversations about the nature of the field. I think the expansiveness of Black Studies out into, outside the campus, right? Its relation to community is always really is almost exclusively posed in terms of politics, right? How do we intervene in terms of police violence, mass incarceration, poverty, et cetera. But what we often don't talk about, which I'm so happy to hear you talk in such detail about, is that museum space is community space, right? But it's also exactly where Black Studies ought to have a home, or where Black Studies has made a home, right? And so it's expansiveness that way. And I'm always interested in the way these things speak back to our own idea of who we are and what we do on campuses, right? That community relationship is not missionary, right? It's dialogical, and I love the way you've brought that out. Well, let me ask it maybe in that sort of spirit then. What do you think that the field of Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
That's another good question that I often don't think in these terms, so I think it's stretching me in an exciting way. I think, I'll tell a little bit of a story to get at the first one, which is what I think the field has to offer, what it's doing well. It's part of the transformation of the American Wing at the Brooklyn Museum. One of the frameworks, so we organized the collection within these 8 distinct frameworks. Frameworks we're thinking about ideas and action, which I think is that's something that I got from my time in ethnic studies, thinking about both the intellectual and, what this dialogic that you're setting up, like what does it mean to have both ideas, but then also pair them with action. And so each of these frameworks is taking these ideas and actions as curatorial provocations and lenses on the collection. So the first, one of the first frameworks is radical care. It's really inspired by Saidiya Hartman's, in talking about Christina Sharp's work. She has this really poetic moment where she says, care is the antidote to violence. And many of these collections represent, the violence, right? The history of the United States, right? They're representative of violent displacement, genocide, oppression, mass enslavement. These collections are representative of this history too. And they're emerging alongside this history. And so in this section, Radical Care, in this framework, we're really thinking about modes of curatorial care that open up different kinds of possibilities for understanding these historic works like landscapes, still lifes, works that represent indigenous, peoples, works that, depictions of plantations, but then also works made by Black, then not Americans, but then the enslaved Africans that were brought over to make Kelowna wares, and to make, pottery and all, produce furniture, these objects, these material cultures of the United States. So all of this is in this gallery, and we're thinking about ways of thinking and knowing, like Sankofa, concepts that have like been hugely influential in Black and diaspora studies, concepts that, instruct us to look back in order to move forward. We're also thinking about indigenous epistemologies like gratitude and rematriation. So all of this to say, in the center of this particular framework, we built a structure that is called the American Art Study. And we filled the structure. So in addition to hanging artworks from the collection, it's filled with bookshelves. Bookshelves that have the work, the work from the fields across, intersecting and not with art history, colonial studies, decolonial studies, Black studies, environmental justice studies. But also in these niches, we have these syllabi. And so I'm going to get to the point where I'm hoping that the success of Black studies becomes apparent, because what I think one thing that came out of the pandemic that was really, really fascinating to see was the mobilization of pedagogy and knowledge. There was this moment where Black studies scholars in particular were doing, kind of an outsized, we're always doing outsized labor in education and, providing resources for folks to understand history and context when we have things like, the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. Like, how do we contextualize and understand these incidents? And so Black studies scholars were coming out on social media, and they were displaying their syllabi, their stacks of books. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah. And it was a way to contextualize and understand what people were experiencing, both visually, but then also culturally and politically in the moment. And so we've borrowed this impulse, right, to share and disseminate and to produce cultural knowledge for this American Art Study. And so we invited scholars, interdisciplinary scholars across the field, to contribute their syllabi, where we purchased the books and stacked them similar to the ways that they were accessible on social media, now in relationship to the collection, right? Creating these additional contexts, these additional layers. And so I'm hoping that, it's hard to describe. I'm hoping people will actually have a chance to see this structure and kind of the ways we're bringing these intellectual traditions in conversation with the visual. But this, to me, really symbolizes the success and the potential of Black studies. To answer the other part of your question, as far as like what we have to, or what the field has maybe not done so well, I think we kind of answered it a little bit ago, in the sense that where would we like to see the field turn, or I think is more how I would frame that, what ways might the field orient itself toward visual culture or material culture in ways that is not exclusive, or in ways that don't exclude beauty, right? I think that's kind of a little bit of a dark sheep in the field. We don't want to talk about, or I feel like there's a reluctance to talk about the visual in terms of maybe something that's subjective as beauty, and what it means to build one's understanding of Blackness as something that, might help us see.
I really love that. I mean, it makes for an interesting kind of turn of, Black is beautiful. Well, what is beauty in Black studies?
Yeah.
That's sort of, if you think about the founding of Black studies, it really is at the Black is beautiful moment. But what is beauty to Black studies in 2024? It's a really interesting question to return to us. I love that. Yeah. So maybe that is your answer then to this final question, which is, what do you think we should all be thinking about? What's the question we should all be asking?
I love that we are all asking different questions, so I don't want to change that. But I do think it would be wonderful if we could collectively start thinking about Black joy. what would joy look and feel like, I think is something that I'm deeply interested in right now. And yeah, to kind of round out on this idea of beauty, I have the great good fortune of regularly operating within the realm of beauty aesthetics. And I argue in Black joy. And, I really do see an artist or a creative, a creative's kind of proclivity toward making, particularly amid and against overwhelming violence, historical oppression, and, cultural erasure. These things are nothing short of miraculous. But for me, it also represents a kind of, if we think of Black joy, and I know in our earlier conversations, I mentioned to you the work of Ross Gay, he's really thinking about joy as what we, not something that we experience, as an escape from all of the things that we talked about, violence, oppression, exclusion. But actually, what if we think of joy as, what effervesces from us as we hold and carry together the sorrow, the violence, the pain? What if joy is the work, right? The work that we do of making visible the erased or what's been erased, and what if joy is what, is how we come together, and what if joy is what artists produce out of pain, suffering? Alice Walker has this beautiful portrait of In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, thinking about like the garden as this radical act of Black space making, or this radical act of like, what if you make beauty out of nothing? And Black people are, that is what we do, in a sense, and in what we have historically. I think so much to offer is like, how do we create all of this beauty out of nothing? And I think I would love for us to think about that in terms of like the rigors of joy, and the rigors of beauty. Black studies, demands to be recognized, studied, and understood, is particularly in the context of the Black experience and the intellectual traditions. But I would also argue that art, the production of visual culture, functions much in the same way. It's an insistence of presence and beauty and belonging. And at least that's what I'll be thinking about for a while.
I love that. I'm really moved by that. That's just a really wonderful place to conclude this conversation. And it brings us back to the kinds of spaces you're making, right? And the lessons that you draw from your study. And so I love that as a place to conclude. It brings so much of this together. So, and thank you for your time, Stephanie. I mean, I really love the work that you do. I love the way you think about what you're doing. And I'm so happy that we have it on the podcast. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a real pleasure.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you. You as well.